The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Sarah Chen's living room as she folded another load of laundry. It was a typical Sunday in her suburban home in Atlanta, Georgia. At 32, Sarah had settled into a comfortable routine that rarely saw surprises. Her dark hair was tied in a messy bun, and she wore her favorite worn-out Yale sweatshirt, a reminder of her law school days. The sound of the doorbell broke through the quiet house. Sarah wasn't expecting anyone. Her husband Michael was away on a business trip, and her friends usually texted before dropping by. She placed the half-folded towel on her coffee table and walked to the door. Through the peephole, she saw a young black woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s. The stranger wore a neat blue blazer and clutched what looked like an old envelope in her hands. She shifted nervously from one foot to another. Sarah opened the door, keeping one hand on the frame. "Can I help you?" "Are you Sarah Chen?" the young woman asked. Her voice was soft but determined. "My name is Maya Williams. I need to talk to you about James Chen. He was your grandfather, wasn't he?" Sarah's hand tightened on the doorframe. Her grandfather had passed away 3 months ago, and the wound was still fresh. "Yes, he was. What is this about?" Maya pulled out an old photograph from her envelope. "This is your grandfather, isn't it? With my grandmother, Rose Williams?" Sarah took the photograph with trembling hands. The image was faded and had yellow edges, but she could clearly see her grandfather, much younger than she'd ever known him, standing next to a beautiful black woman in front of what looked like a small store. They were both smiling at the camera, and her grandfather's hand rested companionably on the woman's shoulder. The date stamp read, June 1963. I don't understand," Sarah said, but something in her stomach tightened. She had never seen this photograph before, had never heard of a Rose Williams, had never known about any connection between her Chinese-American family and a black family during the Civil Rights era. Maya's eyes grew wet. "My grandmother passed away last month. Before she died, she told me about James Chen, about their friendship, about what happened. She made me promise to find his family." Sarah found herself stepping back from the door. "Please come in." The words came out before she could think about them. Maya entered the house, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Sarah led her to the living room, hastily moving the laundry aside. They sat across from each other, the old photograph between them on the coffee table. "I know this must be strange," Maya said, pulling out more photographs and papers from her envelope. "But my grandmother and your grandfather shared a deep friendship. She kept everything: letters, photos, even old receipts from the store where they worked together." Sarah picked up another photograph. This one showed her grandfather and Rose at what appeared to be a birthday party. There were children in the picture too, including a little boy who looked remarkably like Sarah's father. "That's my dad," Sarah whispered, pointing to the boy. "But you never mentioned any of this." "My grandmother said there was a reason for that," Maya replied carefully. "A reason why their friendship had to end. She never blamed your grandfather, but she wanted the truth to come out eventually. She said some stories shouldn't stay buried forever." Sarah felt a headache coming on. Her grandfather had been a quiet man, always kind but reserved. He had built a successful life after immigrating from China, running a chain of grocery stores across Georgia. The family narrative had always been simple: work hard, keep your head down, achieve the American dream. But this photograph showed something else, a hidden connection, a relationship that somehow got erased from their family history. "There's more," Maya said, pulling out a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. "So much more. Your grandfather was a different kind of man than maybe you knew. My grandmother said he was one of the bravest people she ever met." Sarah stared at the bundle of letters, her heart pounding. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting the room in deep orange light. She realized that her simple Sunday afternoon had just become the beginning of something much bigger, a journey into a past her family had carefully hidden away. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, finally looking up at Maya. "I need to know the truth." That night, after Maya left, Sarah couldn't sleep. Her mind kept going back to the photographs and the story Maya had begun to tell. Around midnight, she found herself climbing the narrow stairs to her attic, flashlight in hand. The attic was dusty and filled with boxes her father had brought over after grandfather James passed away. "Just some old papers," he had said. "Nothing important." But now Sarah wondered what secrets these boxes might hold. She pulled down box after box, sneezing from the dust. Most contained old tax papers, receipts, and Chinese newspapers. Then, in a corner behind an old suitcase, she found a small red box that looked different from the others. It was made of worn leather and had Chinese characters carved into its lid. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. Inside, she found dozens of letters, neatly bundled with string. Some were written in flowing Chinese characters, others in careful English. She picked up the first letter, dated March 15, 1962. Dear James, it began. Thank you for standing up for my Tommy today. Not many store owners would defend a black child against a white customer. My boy hasn't stopped talking about how Mr. Chen told that man to leave his store if he couldn't be civil to all customers. You're either very brave or very foolish, my friend. Perhaps both. Rose. Sarah sat on the dusty attic floor, pulling out letter after letter. Through Rose's words, a different version of her grandfather emerged. She learned how James had first hired Rose to work in his small grocery store, even though other Chinese store owners warned him against hiring black staff. How Rose had taught James better English, and he had taught her basic Chinese. How they shared lunches in the back room, trading stories about their families. One letter made Sarah gasp. Dated July 1963, it was written in her grandfather's handwriting. Dear Rose, today was dangerous. Those men who came to threaten the store, I saw real hate in their eyes. But I meant what I said. I won't stop serving black customers, and I won't fire you. My father taught me that a man must stand for something. In China, we lost everything because we stood silent while others suffered. I won't make that mistake in America. Your friend always, James. Sarah found more letters describing how Rose and James helped each other survive those difficult times. Rose would warn James about which streets to avoid when the Klan was active. James would keep his store open late so black families could shop safely after dark. They built a friendship based on protecting each other in a world that was hostile to them both. The most touching letters were about their families. Rose wrote about her children, including Maya's mother Linda, who was just a baby then. James wrote about his young son Thomas, Sarah's father, and how Rose would watch him when James had deliveries to make. Dear James, one letter read. Little Thomas is growing so fast. Today he called me Auntie Rose for the first time, and my heart nearly burst. He's as smart as his father and twice as stubborn. He spent all afternoon trying to learn how to write his name in Chinese characters, just like you. That boy is going to make you proud one day. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she read. This was her father as a child, growing up with a second family she had never known about. What had happened to break this bond? Why had her father never mentioned Rose or her family? The answer came in a letter dated December 1965. The paper was wrinkled, as if it had been wet with tears. My dearest friend Rose, this letter is the hardest I have ever had to write. My marriage has been arranged to a woman from Hong Kong. Her family is powerful and has connections with immigration officials. They say I must cut all ties with your family. They say it's not proper for a Chinese man to be so close to a black family. My heart is breaking, but I must protect my son. If they report me, I could be deported, and Thomas would lose his father. Please forgive me. I will never forget your kindness. James. Sarah sat in the attic until dawn, surrounded by these letters that told the story of friendship, courage, and heartbreaking choices. Now she understood why Maya had come. These weren't just old letters. They were proof of a connection that had been buried, but never truly broken. As the morning sun began to shine through the small attic window, Sarah made a decision. She needed to talk to her father. It was time to understand why he had kept this part of their family history hidden for so long. Sarah invited Maya to meet her at a small coffee shop the next morning. She brought the red box of letters with her, placing it carefully on the table between them. Maya arrived carrying her own collection of documents and old newspapers. I spent all night reading these, Sarah said, touching the box gently. But I need to understand more. Tell me everything you know about how our grandparents worked together. Maya pulled out an old newspaper clipping from 1962. It showed a small storefront with Chen's Grocery written on the window. This was where it all started, she explained. Your grandfather's first store was on Auburn Avenue, right in the heart of Atlanta's black community. The black and white photograph showed James Chen standing proudly in front of his store. Rose Williams stood next to him, both wearing shop aprons. Even in the faded image, their smiles were bright and confident. My grandmother told me stories about that store my whole life, Maya continued. It was different from other stores. Your grandfather gave black customers credit when they needed it. He let them shop through the front door, not the back like other stores made them do. And he always treated everyone with respect. Sarah listened as Maya described how the friendship between their grandparents grew stronger during those dangerous years. James taught Rose how to manage the store's books, skills that were usually denied to black workers. In return, Rose helped James understand the unwritten rules of surviving in the segregated South. There was this one time, Maya said, pulling out another photograph, when some white men came to threaten the store. They were angry because your grandfather had hired my grandmother as his assistant manager. But instead of firing her, he put up a sign in Chinese that said, "Closed for inventory," whenever those men came around. Sarah smiled through her tears. I found a letter about that. Rose taught him to recognize which cars belonged to troublemakers, so he could close the store before they arrived. The two women spent hours sharing stories, piecing together how their grandparents had protected each other. During the summer of 1963, when tensions were highest, James would close his store early and drive Rose home himself, making sure she arrived safely. When James got sick with flu that winter, Rose ran the store for 2 weeks, telling customers he was supervising from home, so no one would know a black woman was in charge. But it wasn't all about survival, Maya said softly. They created something special in that store. My grandmother said it was like a safe place where both Chinese and black people could feel human. She showed Sarah more photographs. One of Rose teaching James to make cornbread in the store's back room, another of James celebrating Chinese New Year with Rose's family, pictures of their children playing together while their parents worked. Look at this one, Sarah said, pulling out a photograph from Christmas 1964. It showed Rose's children and young Thomas Chen decorating a small Christmas tree in the store. My father looks so happy here. I've never seen him smile like that in our family photos. Maya nodded. My mom remembers those days. She said your father used to call my grandmother Auntie Rose and would run to her for hugs whenever he visited the store. They were more than friends. They were family. The most powerful story came from the summer of 1964, when James caught a group of teenagers stealing food from his store. Instead of calling the police, he talked to them and learned they were from families who couldn't afford to eat. After that, he and Rose started a program where poor families could work in the store for food. They understood each other's struggles, Maya explained. My grandmother said your grandfather knew what it felt like to be treated as an outsider, and he taught her that standing together made them stronger. Sarah stared at the collection of photos and letters spread across the coffee shop table. Each piece told part of a story about two people who chose friendship over fear, who found ways to help each other survive and thrive in a world that wanted to keep them apart. They were so brave, Sarah whispered. I wish I had known this story growing up. It might have changed how I saw everything. Maya reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. That's why my grandmother wanted us to find each other. She said their story wasn't just about the past. It's about healing the present, too. As they sat there, surrounded by evidence of their shared history, both women felt the weight of their grandparents' legacy. It was a story of courage, friendship, and the kind of love that transforms ordinary lives into something extraordinary. Sarah sat in her father's living room 2 days later, the red box of letters on her lap. Thomas Chen, now 62 years old, stared at the box with a mix of recognition and fear in his eyes. His wife Susan kept bringing them tea nobody drank. Where did you find that? Thomas asked quietly. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the box. In the attic, with grandfather's things, Sarah replied. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me about Rose Williams? What happened? Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were filled with tears. Something Sarah had never seen before. He picked up one of the photographs showing him as a child, sitting on Rose's lap while she read him a story. I was 8 years old when everything changed, he began. His voice trembled with emotion. Auntie Rose, that's what I called her, was like a second mother to me. She taught me how to read, how to count money, how to be brave. He pulled out another photograph, this one showing the arranged marriage of James Chen to Lin Ma, Sarah's grandmother. Your grandmother's family was very powerful in Hong Kong. They helped many Chinese people come to America. But they had traditional views about race. Sarah watched as her father's face filled with pain as he told the story. The Ma family had discovered James Chen's close friendship with a black family. They were horrified that their daughter would marry into a family that broke racial barriers. They threatened to report your grandfather to immigration officials, Thomas explained. Back then, even small violations could get you deported. They said they would make sure he lost everything: his store, his visa, his right to stay in America. Sarah remembered the last letter she had found, the one where her grandfather had to say goodbye to Rose. Now she understood the tear stains on that paper. Your grandfather had no choice, Thomas continued. He had to protect me. If he got deported, I would have grown up without a father. But the way it happened. He stopped, choking back tears. Tell me, Sarah whispered. It was a Sunday afternoon. Your grandfather told me we had to stop going to the store. I didn't understand why. I cried and begged to see Auntie Rose, but he said we couldn't. Not ever again. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. The next day, he sold the store to another Chinese businessman who fired Rose immediately. Sarah gasped. She hadn't known this part. Your grandfather couldn't even warn her, Thomas said. The Ma family had people watching us. Rose came to our new house once, trying to understand what happened. I saw her through my bedroom window, but your grandfather had to pretend he wasn't home. He pulled out another photograph, one Sarah hadn't seen before. It showed Rose standing alone in front of the old store, now with a different name on the window. She looked lost, betrayed. The worst part was the silence. Thomas continued. We never talked about them again. Your grandfather started a new store in a different neighborhood. He became successful, made more money. But he was never the same. The light went out of his eyes. Sarah thought about Maya, about the strength it must have taken for Rose to tell this story to her granddaughter without bitterness. Your grandfather tried to make it right, in his own way, Thomas said, reaching for an envelope in his desk drawer. He secretly put money aside every month. When Rose's son wanted to go to college, anonymous scholarships appeared. When her daughter needed surgery, the hospital bills were mysteriously paid. Sarah looked at the envelope. Inside were bank records showing decades of secret payments to the Williams family. He couldn't be their friend anymore, Thomas said softly, but he never stopped caring. The Ma family controlled our lives. They couldn't control his heart. Sarah understood now why this story had stayed buried for so long. The shame, the pain, the impossible choice between survival and friendship. It was almost too much to bear. Dad, she said gently, Maya Williams came to see me. Rose's granddaughter. She knows the whole story. Rose told her before she died, and she wanted our families to reconnect. Thomas's eyes widened. She knows? And she doesn't hate us? No, Sarah replied, thinking of Maya's kindness. She understands. Rose understood too. They want healing, not hatred. Thomas Chen covered his face with his hands and began to cry. For the father who had to betray his principles, for the friendship that was sacrificed, and for the little boy who lost his beloved Auntie Rose. 3 weeks after her father's confession, Sarah sat in Maya's small apartment, surrounded by more family documents. Maya had brought out a worn journal that belonged to Rose, written in the years before her death. The two women had been meeting regularly, trying to understand their family's shared past. My grandmother wrote this during her last year, Maya explained, carefully opening the journal. She knew she was dying, and she wanted to record everything she remembered. But there's one entry I think you need to read. The journal entry was dated just 2 months before Rose passed away. Today I saw James Chen's obituary in the paper. My old friend has gone to rest. The news brought back so many memories, both sweet and painful. The young ones today won't understand what it meant back then, for a Chinese man and a black woman to be true friends. We weren't just breaking rules, we were showing that love is stronger than hate. Even when they forced him to push me away, I knew in my heart he never wanted to. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as Maya continued reading. I've never told my family the whole truth, Rose had written. They know James as the man who fired me, who sold the store and disappeared from our lives. Only I knew about the college funds that appeared for my children, the medical bills that were mysteriously paid. Only I recognized his handwriting on the unsigned Christmas cards that came every year for 40 years. Maya pulled out a stack of these cards, simple holiday wishes written in James Chen's distinctive style, never signed but faithfully sent year after year. Sarah recognized her grandfather's handwriting immediately. My grandmother kept every single one, Maya said softly. She knew they were from him, even though he could never admit it. The journal continued. I'm writing this for my granddaughter Maya. She needs to know that hate didn't win. James never betrayed our friendship in his heart. Sometimes life forces good people to make impossible choices. I forgave him long ago. Now it's time for our families to heal. Sarah thought about her own family's silence, how her father had carried this pain for decades, how her grandfather went to his grave never speaking about Rose. The weight of unspoken words had shaped them all. There's more, Maya said, turning to another page. My mother finally told me something last week. She remembered being very young, maybe 5 years old, when she was sick with pneumonia. The hospital wouldn't treat black children properly back then, but somehow she got the best doctor, the best medicine. Sarah nodded. My grandfather must have pulled strings. He knew many important people by then. Yes, Maya agreed. But that's not the whole story. My mother remembers waking up one night in the hospital and seeing your grandfather sitting by her bed. He was reading her a Chinese storybook, just like he used to do at the store. When she opened her eyes, he quietly left and never came back. The two women sat in silence, letting the weight of these revelations sink in. Their grandfathers and fathers had lived through a time when friendship across racial lines could destroy lives. The silence that followed had been their way of surviving. Read the last page, Maya said, her voice gentle. Rose's final entry was short but powerful. To whoever finds these words, remember that love leaves marks that hate can never erase. James Chen was forced to close his door to me, but he kept a window open for 40 years. That's the story I want told. Not the betrayal, but the love that survived it. Maya, find his family. Tell them I understood. Tell them it's time to speak again. Sarah looked at the collection of unsigned cards, the secret hospital visits, the anonymous gifts that had supported Rose's family for decades. Her grandfather had found ways to keep his promise of friendship, even when he couldn't speak it aloud. My father carries so much guilt, Sarah said quietly. He thinks your family must hate him for staying silent all these years. Maya reached across and took Sarah's hand. My grandmother's last wish was for healing, not blame. She wanted us to break this chain of silence. That's why I came looking for you. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maya's living room floor. Two women sat among the papers and photographs that told their family's true story. Not just the pain of separation, but the love that had quietly endured through generations of silence. Sarah organized a dinner at her house the following Sunday. Her hands trembled as she set the table for 5 people: herself, her husband Michael, her parents Thomas and Susan, and Maya. The old family photos and letters lay carefully arranged on the coffee table in the living room. Michael squeezed her hand supportively as they heard the first knock. It was Maya, arriving early as planned, carrying a homemade sweet potato pie, Rose's special recipe. My grandmother always said food opens hearts, she explained with a nervous smile. When Thomas and Susan arrived 30 minutes later, the tension in the room became thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas stopped in the doorway when he saw Maya, his face turning pale. She looked so much like a young Rose that he had to grip the doorframe for support. Hello, Mr. Chen, Maya said softly. I'm Rose Williams's granddaughter. Thomas stood frozen, years of buried emotions fighting their way to the surface. Susan touched his arm gently, encouraging him forward. They'd all sat down in the living room, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Sarah took a deep breath and began. Dad, we need to talk about everything. About Rose, about grandfather, about why our families split apart. Maya deserves to hear it from you. Thomas stared at his hands. I don't know if I can, he whispered. Please, Maya said. My grandmother never stopped caring about your family. She understood why things happened the way they did. There's no anger here, Mr. Chen. Only hope for healing. Thomas looked up, tears in his eyes. I was just a boy, he began, his voice shaking. Auntie Rose. She was like a second mother to me. When we had to cut ties with her family, it broke something in me. I learned to stay quiet, to never question, to push down all the memories. Sarah pulled out the Christmas cards her grandfather had secretly sent to Rose every year. But grandfather never really let go, did he? He found ways to help, to stay connected, even if he couldn't do it openly. The Ma family, your mother's relatives, Thomas said, turning to his wife Susan. They watched us for years. We had to prove we were respectable Chinese people. No mixing with black folks. No causing trouble. That was the price of staying in America. Susan touched her husband's hand. I never knew the whole story, she admitted. I just knew there were subjects we didn't discuss. Maya pulled out her grandmother's journal. My grandmother wrote about those years, about how she would sometimes see your father watching from a distance when her children graduated from college, the college education he secretly paid for. She wrote about how he would send anonymous gifts to her grandchildren every Christmas. Thomas broke down then, decades of suppressed grief pouring out. I wanted to reach out so many times. When I saw Rose at the grocery store, I would turn down another aisle. When I heard she was sick last year, I drove past her house every day but couldn't bring myself to knock. The past shaped us all, Maya said gently. But my grandmother's last wish was for our families to find each other again. She believed love was stronger than fear. Sarah watched as her father slowly reached for one of the old photographs, the one showing him as a child, celebrating Chinese New Year with Rose's family. I remember this day, he said softly. Rose made traditional Chinese dumplings, but added her own southern touch to them. We laughed so much. We can't change what happens, Sarah said, but we can change what happens next. We can break this cycle of silence. Maya nodded. That's why I came looking for you. Not to blame anyone, but to rebuild what was broken. Thomas stood up suddenly, walking to where Maya sat. With tears streaming down his face, he knelt before her. Can you forgive me? He asked. For all the years of silence? For not being brave enough to speak up? Maya took his hands in hers. My grandmother already did, she said softly. Now it's time for you to forgive yourself. In the kitchen, the timer dinged. Dinner was ready. As they moved to the dining room, the sweet smell of Rose's potato pie filling the air, something shifted in the atmosphere. The heavy weight of secrets began to lift, replaced by the possibility of healing. Sarah watched as her father pulled out Maya's chair, just as she had seen in photos of her grandfather doing the same for Rose so many years ago. Some gestures, like love itself, survive across generations, waiting for the right moment to bloom again. 2 months after the emotional family dinner, Sarah and Maya sat in the Atlanta History Center's research room. Around them lay stacks of old newspapers, photographs, and community records. They had decided to document not just their own family's story, but to search for other similar stories of friendship between Chinese and black families during the Civil Rights era. Look at this, Maya said, pointing to a yellowed newspaper from 1964. There were 3 other Chinese grocery stores in Sweet Auburn that hired black workers. All of them faced threats and pressure to stop. Sarah nodded, typing notes into her laptop. They had started a blog called Hidden Bonds. Lost stories of civil rights era friendships, and the response had been overwhelming. Other families began reaching out with their own stories. Mrs. Liu called me yesterday, Sarah said, pulling up an email. Her father owned a laundry business in Mississippi. She said they had a secret arrangement with a black seamstress who couldn't get work at white-owned shops. They worked together for 20 years, but had to pretend they didn't know each other in public. Their research project had taken on a life of its own. Local newspapers wanted to interview them. Community groups invited them to speak. Even Thomas, Sarah's father, had started sharing stories at their events, his voice growing stronger each time he spoke about Rose. One afternoon, while they were photographing old documents, an elderly Chinese man approached their table. His hands shook as he placed a brown envelope in front of them. I read about what you're doing, he said quietly. My name is David Wam. I knew your grandfather, James Chen. We were part of a secret group of Chinese business owners who helped black families during those hard times. Inside the envelope were photographs and letters documenting how Chinese shop owners would extend credit to black customers, hire black workers despite threats, and sometimes hide civil rights activists in their back rooms during protests. We couldn't march with them openly, Mr. Wang explained, but we found other ways to help. Your grandfather wasn't alone. Sarah and Maya organized their first community event at the Auburn Avenue Research Library. They called it Breaking the Silence, Asian and Black Solidarity in the Civil Rights South. The small meeting room they booked couldn't hold all the people who showed up. Families brought old photographs, letters, and stories. A black woman in her 70s talked about how a Chinese restaurant owner had secretly fed civil rights protesters. A Chinese man shared how his father's store became a safe meeting place for black community leaders. Thomas Chen stood up to speak near the end of the event. His voice was clear and strong as he told the story of Rose Williams and his father, James Chen. "We kept these stories buried because we were afraid," he said. "But our silence didn't just hide the pain. It also hid the love, the courage, and the friendship that gave people hope. It's time to tell the whole truth." Maya's mother, Linda, spoke next. She shared her childhood memories of James Chen reading to her in the hospital, of the mysterious help that came whenever her family needed it most. "My mother taught me that love finds a way," she said, "even when the world tries to build walls between people." These stories aren't just about the past, they're about who we choose to be today. Sarah and Maya's project grew bigger than they had imagined. They created a digital archive where families could share their stories. They worked with local teachers to develop lesson plans about Asian Black solidarity during the civil rights era. Universities started using their research in history classes. 1 year after Maya first knocked on Sarah's door, they organized a special ceremony at the site of James Chen's old store on Auburn Avenue. The city agreed to place a historical marker there, honoring the friendship between James Chen and Rose Williams. As they unveiled the marker, Sarah saw tears in her father's eyes. The marker read, "On this site stood Chen's Grocery, 1962 to 1965, where Chinese store owner James Chen and his friend Rose Williams proved that courage and friendship could overcome the barriers of their time." Their story inspires us to remember that justice requires both loud voices and quiet acts of solidarity. Maya squeezed Sarah's hand as they looked at the marker. "Our grandparents would be proud," she said softly. "Not just of the marker, but of how their story is helping other families break their silence." Sarah nodded, thinking of all the stories they had uncovered, all the connections rebuilt. "They showed us that love leaves marks that hate can never erase," she said, quoting Rose's journal. "Now it's our job to make sure these marks are never forgotten again." 1 year to the day after Maya first knocked on Sarah's door, both families gathered at Oakland Cemetery for a special memorial service. They stood around James Chen's grave, which had recently been moved next to Rose Williams's final resting place, a decision made by both families to symbolically reunite the old friends. The autumn morning was crisp and clear. Red and gold leaves danced in the gentle breeze as more than 50 people gathered around the graves. There were members of both the Chen and Williams families, along with many other families who had shared their own stories over the past year. Thomas Chen stood between the graves, looking more at peace than Sarah had ever seen him. In his hands, he held his father's red box of letters and Rose's journal. Maya stood beside him, holding a bouquet of mixed flowers, Chinese peonies and roses, representing both families' heritage. "A year ago," Thomas began, his voice steady and clear, "I was trapped in silence. Today, I stand here to celebrate two extraordinary people who showed us what real friendship means. My father, James Chen, and Rose Williams refused to let fear win, even when they were forced apart." Linda Williams, Maya's mother, stepped forward. "When my mother was dying, she told me that love never dies. It just changes shape." She was right. Look at all of us here today, brought together by a friendship that survived 40 years of silence. Sarah watched as her father and Maya's mother unveiled a small plaque that would sit between the two graves. It read, "James Chen, 1925 to 2023, and Rose Williams, 1930 to 2023. Their friendship changed lives across generations. Love leaves marks that hate can never erase." The ceremony continued with stories from both families. Maya shared how her research with Sarah had led to the creation of the Chen Williams Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to documenting and preserving stories of cross-racial friendship and solidarity in American history. "We've collected over 200 stories this year," Maya explained to the gathered crowd. Stories of Chinese families who helped their black neighbors during the civil rights movement, of black families who protected their Chinese friends from discrimination. These weren't just isolated acts of kindness, they were quiet revolutions. Sarah stepped forward next. "Our foundation has started giving scholarships to students who research historical examples of solidarity between different communities. We've named our first award after our grandparents, the Chen Williams Bridge Builders Scholarship." Thomas and Linda together placed the box of letters and the journal in a special waterproof container between the graves. These precious documents would be preserved in the Atlanta History Center, but copies would stay here, symbolically keeping James and Rose's story alive. Mr. David Wong, now a regular at their community events, shared how their story had inspired other Chinese American elders to break their silence. "We carried these memories like heavy stones," he said. "Now we can finally put them down and share their weight with our children." As the ceremony continued, Sarah noticed something remarkable. Around the graves stood people of different races and ages, all connected by stories of courage and friendship. There were children playing together, just as she and Maya had seen in those old photographs from Chen's grocery. Near the end of the service, Thomas did something that brought tears to everyone's eyes. He took out an old, worn Chinese storybook, the same one James Chen had read to Linda in the hospital all those years ago. "This book survived everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father kept it all these years. Today, I want to read it one last time for both our families." As Thomas read the story in Chinese, Maya's mother translated it into English. It was a tale about two trees whose branches grew together despite being planted far apart. Their roots found each other underground, making them stronger together than they ever could have been alone. The ceremony ended with a tradition from both cultures. Following Chinese custom, they burned incense for the ancestors. Then, in the Black Southern tradition, they each placed a small stone on the graves as a sign of remembrance. Sarah and Maya stood together as the crowd began to disperse. Their families were talking and laughing together, making plans for dinner. The wall of silence that had separated them for so long had finally crumbled completely. "You know what's amazing?" Maya said softly. "Our grandparents never got to see this day, but somehow they knew it would come. They kept that hope alive for us." Sarah nodded, watching as her father hugged Linda Williams, no longer afraid to show his love for his childhood's second family. "Sometimes," Sarah replied, "the most powerful stories are the ones that take generations to finish. But look at what they started. It's beautiful." Above them, the autumn leaves continued their dance in the wind, nature's own celebration of a friendship that refused to die, and the new bonds it had created across time.